forget everything you think you know about entropy. But this video isn't even about entropy. I'm not even going to explain to you about what entropy is. In essence, it's actually, I suppose, about living things like us, and the way living things like us perhaps maximize our entropy, whatever that means, maximize our irreversibility. And we'll get into what exactly that might be. You see, this last year I've been having a lot of trouble explaining an idea. And it's the kind of idea that I think moves in a lot of different ways. I think that it could be used to understand our own cellular biology and our evolutionary origins. I think that it could be useful in considering the environmental consequences of life present in our geological record, and in anticipating some of the changes that will now be happening on the surface of this planet in the near future. I also believe that we could use this thing in software engineering and in the designing of very particular kinds of computation machines too, maybe even providing insight on some of the fundamental statistics inside our brains. Alright, okay, those are some pretty big claims. To be fair, this video isn't really about any of those things particularly either. For now, please, if you would allow me to just slow all this down, let's just settle in and listen, because honestly, this has all been a bit of a bother to explain. If I could take you alongside for the last odd year of my life, where I've tried to find ways of talking all this through in a way that actually rounds up nicely. Because you see, since before my graduation last summer, I've had this thing ringing in my ears, and it's been trying to find form, and little by little I found ways to lay it out a little bit, and now I think there could be enough here for some sketch sense of what it's all about. So that's where this story will start now. Let's step back to last summer, and well, I suppose let's see where this takes us. So, entropy is a complicated quantity, and it's often confused with order. But I think I want to make the case to you that actually you shouldn't really be thinking about entropy separately to thinking about engines and the entropy associated with engines. You see, there are two different types of engines. On one hand, you have the engine making that's involved with moving energy around, like the steam engine or the engine in your car. Hello. On the other hand, you have engines that are more probabilistic, that are trying to build models of their environment. And we'll talk about both of those two types of engines, but before we do, I just want to tell you about two things. The first is what an engine is as far as I'm concerned. So when I say engine, I want you to think about some entity that enacts a precise sequence of states in a very particular order, such that the state that it starts in is also the state that it ends in, and so behaves cyclically in a cycle. So when I say engine, I want you to think of just some cyclical sequence of states. Now, the second thing I want to tell you about is something that actually I don't care about. It's called the Carnot engine. Now, if you are doing an undergraduate in physics, then you'll know about the Carnot engine. It's the engine that you get taught in any thermodynamics course. It is the perfect engine. It is the most efficient engine. Victorian scientists came up with it a few hundred years ago. Now, this engine is so efficient precisely because it is reversible. And its reversibility in entropy terms, and we'll talk about entropy more and more and more, but this is, I want the first thing to tell you about entropy. In entropy terms, this engine is so efficient because its entropy is constant across all of the cycles of the sequence of states that it undergoes. So this Carnot engine is efficient because its entropy is not changing. And that makes it very easy to think about it mathematically. It makes it very interesting when you're trying to design things like steam engines or more mechanical motors. But it fails when it comes to talking about living organisms that we see in nature. And why is that? Well, ultimately it's because the Carnot engine is boring. It's simple. It's in equilibrium, it's closed from its environment, and it is reversible, which means its entropy is not changing. And none of those things apply to living organisms. They are constantly in dialogue with their environment. They depend on their environment to persevere. They are not in equilibrium, they're out of equilibrium, but perhaps we'll talk about that further in a future video. And their entropy is by no means constant. So the language of thermodynamics that's very well established can't be applied to living organisms that we see in nature. But there is perhaps some semblance of a solution that we might be able to pursue.
And such a solution lies ultimately, I think, in the unification between these two different types of engines that I alluded to earlier. The heat engine, although hopefully something a little bit less limited, less boring than that Carnot engine, and the inference engine, which I'll elaborate on in a few moments. But you know, this summer my mind was completely scattered in trying to explain all of this to my tutors and friends and fellow students alike. So I invited a friend of mine to come and visit me while I was living in Cambridge to chat all of this through. This is Ewan. Ewan is one of my oldest and closest friends. We grew up here in Dubai together, and we have shared a ton of adventures over the years that I've known him. You know, we've filled buses full of bean bags, we've snuck into sand dunes and played music, and he just finished his engineering masters in Oxford and is now working to help make buildings and cities more carbon neutral and energy efficient and ecologically sustainable. He's got his head really screwed on straight. So we took to the Cambridge River Cam and the College Gardens too, and I attempted to ramble a few million words right through to him.
It seems that the steady state that the atmosphere adopts, that really just is talking about the different way that meridional fluxes of energy and through the collisions of air and Mars and to Titan, and they found the same results. So you have laminar flow of fluid.
In the form of like volcanoes that go off, planet heats up, sea levels rise, large-scale perturbation, and then the way that your system responds, you can see evidence for it in the carbon record because we see
I feel like I ramble too much, and it just seems like irrelevant random bits of information, doesn't it to you?
I think you have to isolate the bits that you want and just write everything down in the stages of like, this is the first bit that I need to talk about, the second bit that I need to talk about, and then how those two link together, and then how it goes into the actual message.
I figured he was right. So this video is about the inference engine side of things, just the basic building blocks. I have loads more things I want to say about this, but I have taken his advice and I'm just taking it down and telling you about this really cool law in information theory that I learned about that is widely unapplied and widely unknown by the physics community.
So, over the last year, I've learnt about the work of a scientist called Edwin James, who, in my opinion, is probably the most important scientist that you've never heard of. Now, this guy worked with probabilities. He was an information scientist, so he was concerned with constructing probability distributions based on incomplete information. He was a Bayesian scientist, which is all about having a limited amount of information on your environment and on your system in question, and having to just do with what you can to try and articulate and model the system in question. And he came up with this principle, and it's called the maximum entropy principle.
So this maximum entropy principle is really just an algorithm, currently buried deep down in the obscure and abstract world of data analysis and Bayesian radio astronomy. Now, what this algorithm does is fairly straightforward. It generates the probability of something taking place, and it ensures that that probability is, well, let's say optimum. It basically makes probability distributions. Now, you might ask, what is a probability distribution? Okay, let me explain. So if I've got a die, a cube with 6 sides, and upon each side is a single number, then the likelihood of any particular number coming up, let's say, is 1/6, and so my probability distribution looks fairly straightforward. It looks like this. If though my die is not fair, in fact it's weighted, it might look a little bit different. Maybe there's more chance for a 6 than a 3 or a 2 than a 1. Now, if the system that I'm looking at actually doesn't contain only 6 discrete options, but perhaps it can occupy a whole continuous range of states, then the probability distribution is going to be a smooth line across the whole range of possibilities. And if it's high up on the axis, it's going to be a very likely outcome. If it's low down on the axis, it's probably going to be rarely occurring. Now, the thing about Bayesian information science and probability in general, and in particular this maximum entropy principle, is that it's concerned with systems that don't just give you the probability distribution. They force you to figure it out based on measurements that you can make with instruments that are perhaps only sensitive to particular things, particular variables. And it allows you to construct probability distributions based on those measurements. I'm going to give you just one equation right now. It's the equation for informational entropy. If I unpack it for you, perhaps you can see here that for every probability distribution, there is a corresponding entropy and vice versa. Now, the maximum entropy principle states that if I maximize my entropy, which is a mathematical operation, I'm going to generate the corresponding probability distribution that minimizes my bias with respect to the constraints that I maximize my entropy to. And the constraints that I maximize my entropy to are just the measurements. They're just the dice rolls that I see, or the particular variables that my instruments are sensitive to. So if I've generated some probabilities this way, I then get a probability distribution, and then I go out and measure some more information. I can then go back and update my probability distribution, maximize my entropy with this extra constraint that I've just measured, and I'm going to generate better odds. And actually I can repeat that cycle again and again and again until my probability distribution is as good as it can be and I can't measure anything better. In fact, even more interestingly, the probability distribution I construct can then inform me on where I go looking for the next bit of data that I use to maximize my entropy. And why I think this is so interesting is because there's a cycle here. This is an inference engine. The cycle is I generate some odds, I use these odds to inform some bet that I make that bet, I see how that bet plays out, and I use that result to then inform my next distribution of odds. I update my odds, and I continue this process in a cycle on and on and on and on. And each time I do this, my probability that gets better and better and better and better.
Okay, let's take a second to summarize, shall we? I hope I haven't lost you too much. Just let's go back and think about the main point here, which is that there are these two different types of engines. There's the inference engine, the heat engine. I've tried to explain about this inference engine. I've explained about how there's, you can think about some entity that's working in a cycle and it optimizing to a principle, and that principle I've tried to explain as the maximum entropy principle, a way of generating this probability distributions. It's widely unapplied at the moment, but that's just a suggestion. And then you have this heat engine. I haven't explained too much, but I've given you the example of the Carnot engine earlier in this video, this engine that is the golden standard for thermodynamic physicists. It's this engine that has an entropy that is not changing and is therefore reversible, which means that as you go through the steps of the cycle, you can actually go backwards either way. It doesn't matter. They're reversible, so you can go step forward, you can step backwards, it doesn't make a difference. Now, this inference engine that I've alluded to, it's actually very different to this Carnot engine when you think about it. Far from it having an entropy that is constant, this guy is maximizing its entropy. It's trying to increase its entropy as much as possible over each cycle. And so, just as the Carnot engine has got a constant entropy and therefore is reversible, the inference engine here is maximizing its entropy, and as it's doing so, it's actually maximizing its irreversibility. So each step of the cycle is a one-directional thing. You can't go back once you've done that. Now, gosh, this is the. Now I'm having a bit of difficulty now in this part of the video because I'm worried that I'm losing focus, because I could talk a lot about what the implications to irreversible systems are and why it might make sense to think about some systems as wanting to maximize their irreversibility, especially probabilistic systems that are trying to learn and not forget. And I'm also really aware that I could go for a long time about how this inference engine probably does have a heat engine counterpart that looks quite different to the Carnot engine, but yet still extracts heat from an environment just like the Carnot engine, performs work on the energy it extracts just like the Carnot engine, and also deposits its heat back into the environment, which is a really crucial part of engines. I don't want to lose focus though, so I think we're gonna have to leave those two things to a future video, and I will try and explain those in way more detail. I think that I could go at great length about them. But I think what we're going to do for the rest of this video is to try and talk about how this inference engine could apply to living things, and why it, this principle, this maximum entropy principle, is a good principle to base a living organism's optimization processes from.
So let me talk to you about another conversation I had with a friend of mine last year at the end of summer.
Can you imagine heat and work ever having a computational
I
definition?
spoke to a friend of mine called Ryan. This is Ryan. I apologise on behalf of Ryan for his lack of decency here. You see, Ryan grew up in the Highlands of Scotland, and so actually whenever there's the sun in the sky, he feels absolutely obliged to remove his shirt. I went to university with him up in Scotland as well. He used to turn up in shorts and a t-shirt on the coldest days of the year. But we love Ryan. He's definitely one of the cleverest people I have ever had the opportunity to meet and speak to. He's now doing his PhD in phenomenology, which is the study of what the basic building blocks of the universe are, and in physics as well, and high energy physics. I actually went to visit him up in Scotland once in his hometown. He helped build this house with his father. He grew up building and making and tinkering and coding and fixing tractors and, well, breaking tractors. Actually, when I went up, we did break a tractor. Anyway, we took to the country park that was close by. We took our bikes out. He fixed my bike for me.
Thank you, Ryan, for fixing my bike.
Thank you for fixing my bike. And while we were there, I sat down with him and I asked him to explain evolution to me, like to try and give me some kind of physical principle for the process of evolution. And this is what he had to say.
It's like you have a massive experiment you just keep running over and over again, and every iteration you have things that do better and things that do worse. The things that do worse die, and the things that do better survive, therefore propagating their traits that perform better.
Yeah, fair enough. So how then does that individual interact with different individuals? How do they all depend on each other or their overall environment? I guess I wanted to know whether the environment was the master of the organisms, or if the organisms themselves were ever the masters of their own environment.
This reminds me of the classic maths biology example of predator and prey cycle, where they start off the same, so the prey gets eaten and then the predators diminish the number because they have less food, which means they eat less prey, so the predators. So it's like, for example, when there was an early time when life was forming,
So then we moved on to talking about how early life had some really big and significant impacts on the state of the planet.
What I'm trying to get at is that you have this massive body of organisms who are changing their environment, and they're changing the environment for everybody.
And then we remembered something called the Great Oxygenation Event, which was the first main big extinction event, which occurred when our atmosphere filled up with oxygen because of single-celled organisms.
When bacteria first came up with photosynthesis, oxygen filled up the atmosphere, and basically everything died because there was so much oxygen. No one had become accustomed to dealing with the oxygen.
Well, that's what happened.
Yeah.
They literally killed the stuff that's producing
Yeah,
oxygen.
exactly. Because this dynamic is so interesting because it's like these guys. You think of oxygen as their waste product, and there's no evolutionary requirement to even have to address the waste product that they're producing. And then it fills up all of the air in the room, and then they suffocate.
Yeah.
It seemed really interesting that by depositing something so seemingly insignificant, some byproduct that's simply unaccounted for, the whole planet eventually shifted in response. And it made me wonder about the underlying principles in probability theory that could be involved in the process of natural selection.
Because I haven't really read anything about that concept of living organisms optimizing according to some rule. Firstly, there's no real rule that things supposed to be optimizing to that I've ever read. What's the rule? Is the rule maximum?
In the end, we were left wondering whether an organism that actually optimized according to maximum entropy would have an advantage over ones that didn't.
So this concept of bias is really important. If you're an investor and you're making your investments based on some odds, you might ask who's generating those odds. Maybe let's say that's the bookkeeper. Now the bookkeeper's job is to obtain all the relevant information needed to consider one particular event taking place and calculate the likelihood of that event taking place based on that information. But that's a pretty hard job, and no bookie can be perfect. But in an ideal world, the perfect investor has the perfect bookie next to them, and the perfect bookie is the one that minimizes its own bias. It's not adding any extra superfluous information to inform their distribution of outcomes. So, the best investments are corresponding to the minimum bias in your bookie, and the minimum bias corresponds to the maximum entropy, informational entropy, subject to the information that bookkeeper knows. So there's this connection between maximization of entropy and best bets. Well, okay, how is this relevant then, you might ask? Well, I don't know for sure, but the more I think about it, the more I realize that nature's pretty good at making bets, right? I mean, the trees are counting on the soil beneath their feet. The dandelions, here we have one. They're counting on the wind, moving it around, right? Finding it in some different part of the grounds to plant soil to distribute its seeds. So the flowers are betting on the wind, right? The trees are betting on the soil, on the rain. They're betting on the animals to distribute the fruit. The flowers are betting on the bees on the flowers. When you look at ecosystems, they seem to be these environments where all these different agents are betting on each other, working to pass. They've all tuned to become accustomed to
Their environment. They've all tuned to become accustomed to each other. In fact, it leaves one to wonder, I think, upon the consequence to perturbations, some kind of adjustments brought on by changing winds or warming tides or sweltering summers or springs more like late autumn winters. This highly regulated market of bet makers betting interchangeably, how this economy adjusts when the bets suddenly stop paying out like they used to in a way that they've never done before. Makes one wonder, doesn't it? So that's where we are right now. I think that my plan to make this clear and concise maybe hasn't quite manifested. A couple of the people I've shown this to have said that the message isn't particularly clear. But it's hard to see just how widely relevant and applicable this all is without specific examples. Like questions such as what is a bet, how do you define an event, how exactly does a living organism maximize its entropy, what does that practically mean? This stuff is going to make a lot more sense when applied to molecular biology. There's a protein that I really want to tell you about. It's really important to the way that a cell functions, and I think that there's a fairly straightforward way of modeling this protein using maximum entropy maxent. And I think once you see how this little biological engine is extracting work from a thermal environment using, let's say, calculated investment or bet making, then I think that it become apparent just the number of different scales and levels you can apply this theory. And then there's the stuff I was talking about with Ryan and Ewan, stuff that's really more of a step back and looks at the bigger picture, concerns itself more with, well, thinking about, well, if you've got a collection of living organisms that are all operating in a similar way, how does that have an influence on the overall environment? How does that have significance when you think about quantities like entropy production? And specifically, I want to talk to you about 3 periods in our geological history that I think you can maybe perhaps use to shed light on some of this stuff. So the first is during a very famous period of time when life exploded in terms of its diversity and volume on the planet, during the Cambrian period. The second period of time that I want to talk to you about is just after a big extinction event in the early Triassic. And then I also want to talk to you about, in the relatively recent mid-Cretaceous, there was these big long periods of time when the deep ocean was completely empty of oxygen for some reason. And then there's the computation, the statistics, the neuroscience. I think that inshallah this will come in time, but it's specifically, I think I can tell you about this really cool theory by a man called Carl Friston, who's a very well-respected neuroscientist. He's come up with this theory which says that the brain falls into states of minimum free energy. And I think that in certain cases there's a very intimate relationship between minimum free energy and maximum entropy. But this will come in time, I think. I think if you're interested in this straight away, Carl Friston did make a video about it. And it's a good video, and you can understand it if you watch it a few times and pause after everything he says to try and think about what he means. And I'll give a link to that in the description. Actually, speaking of the description, there's going to be a lot in there, lots of further reading, references, that kind of thing. I'm going to write a transcript of everything that I've said in this video, and I'm going to probably write a bit more rigorous references for some of the things that I've said. And also going to add some footnotes because I've made some pretty extreme simplifications in some cases, and I just want the opportunity to justify those a little bit. I mean, it's difficult because I think from my perspective this video seems to not really be talking about anything. It just seems to be making lots of promises and just getting very surface level, and I want to be able to go into more detail, but the reality is that I do need to just post this. I'm very, very, very fortunate. I'm extremely fortunate, but I can't continue. I don't have the means to be doing this really for any longer. So I don't want to ask you for money, because I don't really want to ask you for money for no reason. I don't want to run advertisements on my videos here because I don't get to choose what adverts come up, which I think is a bit weird. And I also don't want to have to be posting really regularly in order to have some kind of stability. So this last year I've also been developing an idea, and it's going to be a bit of a curveball, but it's something I'm really interested in, so I want you to stick with it. I think you could be passionate about it too. I also made a website about art. It's a website called Pictures of Paintings, and it basically serves to teach people about art, showcase art, curate art. It's like an inside online virtual art museum, and it's really fun just to wander around it. I'll just try and explain to you some of what the behind the scenes is with the scene behind me.
It's pretty straightforward. It's just a matter of taking a picture of a frame and changing the colors, and then taking a picture of a painting and then changing the colors, and then putting the painting in the frame and changing the colors. I hope you enjoy this very jolly video I made of me exploring the website.
Yeah, I know. So basically it's about art, so paintings and presenting art, curating art and making art more accessible. And I think that I really want to help people appreciate art. There are hundreds of paintings in there. Many of them are hidden actually, but the idea is that you go straight into the main part of the museum, a series of Monet rooms, and then you can go even further out of the museum, and there's a masterworks section of the museum where you can learn about specific paintings and by sort of more wide variety of artists. But yeah, it's something I've worked very hard about, to be honest, and I hope you give it some time just to look at it, preferably on your computer. I don't really know how to design websites on phones, but I built this for a computer. So if you have the time and you want to be able to help me do this, because I want to be able to do this properly and to be able to actually explain my ideas without having to juggle a whole bunch of other things at the same time, then perhaps please consider buying a poster. There are these lovely big large posters of any of the paintings that you might like. They're going to be very high quality, and I've worked very hard on every single presentation of every single painting, and I've tried to frame it properly. And yeah, I know this has been a very long video, and I'm very thankful for you watching this far. Thank you for watching as long as you have. It really is really wonderful of you to be sitting through all of this, and I'm just thankful for that. But I hope you have a wonderful day and keep the faith. Thank you very much for watching.